Edmund Husserl, Germany's foremost philosopher in the first half of the 19th century, and the leading exponent of subjectivism in the tradition of philosophy, was born in 1859 and died in 1938. By an interesting coincidence, John Dewey was also born in 1859, and also Henri Bergson. The year 1859 was thus a notable one for naturalism and anti-naturalism. It was also, as you know, the year of publication of Darwin's Origin of Species and of Marx's Critique of Political Economy. The subjectivist philosophy of Husserl may be regarded as the historical outcome of idealism. It inherited the opposition to naturalism and continued it in a new form. Indeed, Husserl's philosophy, generally known as phenomenology, has proved to be the last stronghold of idealism. In addition to the interest attaching to its own sphere of inquiry, it is of current importance because of its influence on the rapidly growing movement of existentialism. There is good reason to regard Husserl as a serious candidate for membership in the great tradition of philosophy because of his positive contributions to scholarship and his much more debatable sphere of influence, because membership in the great tradition presupposes two types of significance, praiseworthy and the opposite. In any case, a balance sheet is called for. There are living and there are notably conservative elements in the writings of Husserl. There are logically constructive and there are reactionary aspects of his thought and influence. The latter, it must be observed, frequently through no fault of his own. Husserl was born in Czechoslovakia and died in Freiburg, 1938, probably only a short time before the Nazi regime would have put him to death in a concentration camp for racial reasons. His early training was in mathematics, leading to a PhD in Berlin under Weierstrass. At the suggestion of his philosopher friend Masaryk, later the president of Czechoslovakia, Husserl went to hear the noted Catholic philosopher Franz Brentano lecture in Vienna. That proved to be a deciding experience in his development, for it convinced him of the seriousness and worthiness of the life of a philosopher. This also meant contact with the medieval and classical tradition. Franz Brentano was a remarkable teacher, and the term Brentonist signified a firm degree of attachment and fidelity to a master. Brentano knew very well how to develop disciples, and Husserl was fully cognizant of the details. In a revealing tribute to Brentano, Husserl portrayed a master in whom some outstanding traits were already familiar as characteristic of Husserl himself. Among them was Brentano's apparent inability to find his way into the thoughts of another thinker. That could also indicate a degree of unwillingness and of resistance. The large degree of insulation or isolation made possible by the German academic system was responsible for inadequate attention to the ideas of other writers, especially opponents. Under the influence of Brentano and also Stumpf, Husserl became deeply interested in the psychology of the time. The original problem of his intellectual development was in fact conferred by the need to reconcile two seemingly antagonistic modes of thought: pure mathematics, including symbolic logic, which also occupied Husserl early in his development, and psychology, that is, the psychology of the late 19th century. His first published book on the philosophy of arithmetic in 1891 reflects the interest in this problem, although it is handicapped by the use of the current but confusing term content to name objects of thought. That book is distinguished by its recognition of the immediate experience of aggregate or group characters called configurational characters. This makes Husserl to be one of the forerunners of the Gestalt movement, along with Meinong and von Ehrenfels. According to a prominent point of view of the time known as psychologism, the principles and concepts of logic were to be obtained from the psychology of thought processes. Husserl achieved considerable fame as a critic of this point of view, and he is usually credited with refuting psychologism in his logical investigations of 1900 to 1901. The positive portion of these well-known logical studies represented a breakthrough to phenomenology as the descriptive study of the structure of experience and the objects of experience. And they also represent an effort to treat logic as a pure discipline removed from psychological and factual conditions of any kind. In 1913, Husserl was prepared to publish a preliminary statement of his pure phenomenology in his Ideas Toward a Pure Phenomenology. In it, he makes it clear that he is concerned exclusively with essences and not with natural facts, and he outlines in great detail his method of reduction, I would suggest the term restriction, to the conscious processes of an experiencing being, along with the objects which are meant or intended. In this work, Husserl is firmly and outspokenly committed to idealism as a universal philosophy. He makes explicit use of the cardinal principle of idealism, not only as a matter of an artificial procedure, but as a matter of profound conviction. That is to say, the principle that being depends upon being known, that the object of experience depends upon the experiencing being. Husserl did not have to do more than to outline his field of inquiry in terms of what is experienced. There would have been ample justification for a pure phenomenology for the purposes of the description of experience. But his motivation was not limited to description. He was also seriously concerned with the problem of outflanking naturalism and with placing all knowledge, including the sciences, under the leadership of the pure transcendental discipline of phenomenology. Husserl's later publications included his Cartesian Meditations, first published in the French, Formal and Transcendental Logic, The Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, and Experience and Judgment. None of these is available in English as yet. Although he really published a great deal during his lifetime as compared with other productive scholars, he wrote still more using shorthand to record his nascent as well as systematic thoughts as rapidly as possible. At his death in 1938, there were over 11,000 pages of manuscript left, conferring a prodigious problem for editing. To begin with, the manuscripts had to be removed from Germany or they would have been destroyed. Dr. von Breda of Louvain succeeded in that difficult task, and the transcription, the editing have gone forward in Louvain. The hitherto unknown works of Husserl have begun to appear. It is to be hoped that his great descriptive work on time will soon be made available. Husserl believed that he had given philosophy a new and permanent foundation which would enable it to function at the same time as the foundation of all the sciences. Thus, there was the early meaning of phenomenology as the historical successor of empirical psychology, with the function of preparing psychology as an empirical science and providing descriptions of the types and structure of experience. In Husserl's later work, phenomenology was portrayed as first philosophy, with all sciences founded in the realm of pure experience. This was Husserl's vision of a system of philosophy, which would be valid once and for all time, as he put it, and would serve the cultural as well as the natural and theoretical sciences. There can be no doubt that he was least successful in making application to history and the social sciences, and most successful in contributing to descriptive psychology, logic, and the theory of knowledge. In phenomenology, one begins with the stream of experiences of an individual knowing being. This makes possible the achievement of a thoroughgoing level of analysis which probes for the evidence of every item of experience. Thus, one may examine all beliefs in the light of direct experience. But there are also limitations, for one may not escape the dependence upon other knowers, and indeed the very first facts about the place of man in the cosmos. No matter what one is able to establish about the evidence of experience, it is a simple fact that man is a product of a natural process of development, and that he is naturally conditioned as a knowing being. It is an understandable human weakness to become so much accustomed to the use of one type of procedure, in this case subjective in character, that one forgets that the procedure was instituted for the solution of certain problems. The procedure of phenomenology, which may be called pure or radical reflection, with a number of carefully defined conditions, is useful for one set of problems, but not for all types. It must be used in cooperation with other procedures. To claim that it is the only genuinely philosophical method could only stir up hostility in the minds of those who know the demonstrable merits of other types of method. In short, every logically justifiable method has its limitations as well as its special merits. The phenomenological method was intended to achieve, briefly, the following objectives. First, to give as complete as possible an account of the part played by the mind in experience. The mind is recognized as being active. Second, to describe essential structures and connections in experience as so-called eidetic psychology. Third, to clarify basic ideas and to serve as a foundation for logic. Fourth, to provide a unified theory of science and knowledge. Fifth, to define a universal field for philosophical inquiry and thus prepare the ground for the descriptive analysis of experience. And sixth, to help to realize the ideal of a complete descriptive philosophy. This is aided by a procedure which is concerned with all types of experience. But it should always be borne in mind that the absolute beginning which is undertaken in phenomenology is artificial, and that the very place of the inquiring phenomenologist in the actual world must be recognized. That would be a wholesome reminder and would aid in preventing self-deception. This is especially important when one considers Husserl's motive of avoiding naturalism. Opposition to naturalism is prominent in some of Husserl's major publications. It was expressed in his essay on philosophy as a rigorous science, for example. As Husserl depicts naturalism, it sees only nature and physical nature to begin with. It regards all that exists as being psychophysical and is uniquely determined according to laws. All forms of naturalism are opposed by Husserl as involving the naturalizing of consciousness and the naturalizing of what he calls the absolute ideals and norms. In addition to materialism, Husserl opposes energism and positivism, in short, all forms of naturalism. It is his contention that naturalism suspends itself in the last analysis. Characteristic of his style of criticism is the argument that skepticism is incurred when one endeavors to set up an empirical theory of knowledge. Absurdity, he means to say, is incurred. Husserl also undertakes to show that the naturalistic treatment of values is untenable. The naturalist, he argues, is really an idealist who sets up theories which deny what he presupposes with his idealistic attitude. The naturalist preaches, moralizes, and reforms, but he is charged with denying what is presupposed by every sermon or demand as such. This style of argument is not at all satisfying, it must be admitted, for it is hardly more than an ad hominem charge. But Husserl's anti-naturalist arguments are by no means on the same level of quality as his undeniably valuable descriptive results. Certainly the evolutionary philosophers were vulnerable, Spencer, Huxley, and others. They were not, however, to be refuted by ad hominem arguments or by charges of absurdity. The oversimplified version of naturalism which is laid down by Husserl is simply a convenient target. In Husserl's view, all natural science is naive with respect to its point of departure. Nature is simply there for it, he says. One wonders whether anyone ever stimulated Husserl by asking him where else nature could be. And to know what is simply given by means of objective laws is the goal of natural science, including naturalistic psychology. It cannot be denied that the scientific philosophies of Husserl's generation were vulnerable to criticism in a number of respects, even allowing for the existing level of scientific progress. Husserl remarked with right in one of his books, "When it is really natural science that speaks, We listen willingly and as disciples, but the language of the natural scientist is not always that of natural science itself, and is assuredly not so when they speak of natural philosophy and the theory of knowledge of natural science. This may also be taken to apply to naturalistic philosophies. It should be added and asked, however, whether it was necessary to go as far as Husserl did in his opposition to them. It is, of course, more unusual to undertake a balance sheet dispassionately in appraising it than it is to attempt to run the opposition into the ground in toto. Thus it has ever been in the major conflicts of intellectual history. Husserl's early designation of phenomenology as descriptive psychology led to misunderstanding and was later fully repudiated after a thorough reinterpretation. The term phenomenology meant the descriptive analysis of thought experiences to a greater extent than had occurred before, as Husserl stated it in reply to a critic. He argued that it would be nonsense to subordinate pure logic or formal science to psychology. The proposed elucidation of pure logic by Husserl leads him beyond logic and involves a study of the subjective acts of meaning and their relationship to objective structures. The empirical science of psychology could not be expected to provide such a study in his view, since it operates within the frame of a naturalistic view of the world. The phenomenological method, on the other hand, requires that all beliefs about the natural world or about realities of any kind be suspended or placed in abeyance. The term epoché is used, derived from the tradition of skepticism, but used in a different and in a more constructive sense. The descriptions of phenomenology are concerned with essential structures and relations, and the actual experiences of empirical persons are not involved, so that it could not be said to be descriptive psychology. There is no talk of existing human beings, and there are no hypotheses. Phenomenological descriptions deal with what is given in experience as such, the aim being to bring to evidence the essence of that which is experienced. At any time, it is possible to change to the psychological point of view and to restore the assumptions which were suspended. In that way, the findings of phenomenology may be applied to psychology. It was unfortunate that Husserl was led into so extended and acrimonious a controversy with psychologistic philosophers, because it strengthened the impression that he was hostile to psychology as such, which was not the case. As a matter of fact, he did show some hostility on occasion, and he gave evidence at times even of an arrogant disdain of naturalistic psychology. In the sequel to his Ideas, published after his death, he attempted to soften this impression and to assure his readers that scientific psychology was duly respected within limits. The proposed leadership of phenomenology and its alleged infinite potential usefulness for psychology was emphasized to such an extent that Husserl could afford to be magnanimous. In one sense, phenomenology may well be regarded as a fundamental discipline. That is, in the sense in which pure mathematics may be said to be prior to the sciences of physical reality. The concept of being is clarified in phenomenology, for example, so that it can be seen how phenomenology might be regarded as prior to all sciences dealing with being in this sense. That may be true in one sense, that is, for a knower who challenges all beliefs concerning matters of fact in order to examine them in terms of immediate evidence. But in another sense, in terms of the established knowledge about matters of fact, the phenomenologist himself is a latecomer in the evolutionary process, and he must himself follow everything, including a naturalistic theory of reality. That would not have been granted by Husserl, of course. In his early neutral period, he was careful to avoid philosophical idealism as well as what he held to be the naive or dogmatic view of an independent order of natural existence. When he finally accepted the line of idealism, he really abandoned the strict use of the phenomenological method to that extent. Husserl's early slogan, "Back to the things themselves," express the aim of dealing only with what is given in direct experience, in contrast to such a slogan as "back to Kant." As a result, there was no room for speculative constructions in phenomenology. Description in all regions of experience was the aim. With the conditions of description carefully defined, phenomenology was heralded as a new science, a science concerned exclusively with essences and essential relations. The phenomenologist is interested in what can be seen, in what is meant as such. In general, that which is experienced cannot be explained away. It is a finality because it is seen. The descriptive analysis of meaning shows how broadly the concept of seeing is to be construed. The analysis of meaning is properly one of the first themes of the theory of knowledge. We say that we use the same sign or that we express the same meaning at different times. The sounds which are emitted in speaking, say in asserting the proposition n is a prime number, will vary for different people. We say, nevertheless, that the same sign has been used, n. There are also physical variations for the same person if the statement is repeated by him. There will be differences in each repetition. Hence, when we say that we speak of the same signs, we are referring to something unreal or ideal. Thought and experience have the peculiarity of such ideal identifications. The expression n is a prime number is always the same in an ideal sense. This is true not only of statements referring to the real world, but to statements in general, including nonsensical statements. It would not be correct to ask whether such ideal meanings are real in the sense of having a location in space and time, for they are non-real. They are meant and are important features of our mental life. Without them, ordered experience and scientific experience would be impossible. To ask what they are is to ask, however, a misleading question. The experience of ideal meanings is, of course, real, which is another matter. Similarly, the same symphony is played again and again, say Beethoven's Ninth, but it will probably never be the same real event in anyone's experience, for objective and subjective reasons. Even if the musicians were to perform according to a set standard, there would be differences in atmospheric and acoustic conditions. There are also the differences on the part of the person who hears the music. He is bound to hear the same composition, in quotation marks, differently the second time. Neither is the symphony to be identified with any set of symbols, for different sets of symbols may represent the same symphony. The term ideal refers in a non-metaphysical way to this feature of sameness, which is universal in our experience. There is in experience what Husserl calls a synthesis of identification, but care must be taken not to misconstrue it or to hypostatize the ideal unities. One should not yield to the temptation to regard the ideal as above or superior to the changing particular facts of experience. Thus, the extremes of Platonic realism and nominalism must both be avoided, and the phenomenologist, as a descriptive investigator of the essential structures of experience and knowledge, does not have the problem as to whether there are really universals in existence. Existence and all beliefs about existence have been suspended, let us remember, not denied, but simply placed in abeyance, so that the description may proceed without any prior commitments. The point is then to determine how far one can proceed with evidence, meaning by that self-givenness in experience. This descriptive program is defensible, and its value is to be determined by its results. But the suspension of beliefs must not turn out to be an unannounced device for metaphysics. In that case, the radical procedure of suspending beliefs would lead to a new dogmatism. In short, the so-called reduction to pure consciousness, or the restriction to one's conscious experiences and their objects, must not turn out to be like the proverbial lion's den with all footprints pointing inwards. That Husserl attached great importance to Descartes' meditations was shown by his repeated use of the Cartesian method of doubt as a means for introducing his method of phenomenological reduction. One of his most characteristic and profound works, but also one of his most disputed writings, was named in honor of Descartes, the Cartesian Meditations. He regarded Descartes as initiating a new epoch in philosophy, although anticipated by many centuries by St. Augustine. In recognizing the absolute evidence, so-called, of ego cogito, it was Descartes who made possible the systematic use of that insight. Husserl preferred to emphasize the way to subjectivism which Descartes indicated in his Meditations, rather than the insights of that great thinker into the deductive unity of scientific knowledge and the nature of mathematical and scientific method. Neither was it of interest that Descartes' dualistic metaphysics made it possible for him to achieve a modus vivendi for the times, allowing the realm of physical substance to be subject to scientific determination, while providing for traditional philosophical and theological ideas in his theory of the mind and doctrine of innate ideas. It was the pre-reduction, that is, pre-Husserlian Descartes who interested him, and it did not matter that Descartes was only too ready to abandon the quest of systematic doubt which he had so winsomely undertaken. If the Descartes who emerges in Husserl's depiction takes on familiar phenomenological features, that is not surprising. In Husserl's view, the philosopher can only begin by meditating, and the absoluteness of ego cogito must be maintained in order to have the starting point for a transcendental philosophy. The much discussed problem of the transcendence of consciousness results from the line of thought of Descartes' Meditations. The question is stated as follows: how is knowledge of the transcendent possible for us? Or how is it possible that anything transcendent is knowable in consciousness? Here we have restricted ourselves to conscious processes. How can we know anything beyond? If one follows Descartes in the procedure of doubting everything that can be doubted, then the world, other people, my body, are found to be subject to doubt. The doubting experience itself cannot be doubted, and with it, presumably, the doubting intelligence. The objects of man's experiences may not exist in truth, but the experiences themselves may not be doubted. Looking back at Descartes, Husserl remarked that Descartes was not aware of the actual extent of his discovery of the pure experiences, nor that the field of an infinitely fruitful science had been gained, a science that would be fundamental in philosophy. But Descartes did not determine this field of consciousness purely. That was reserved for Husserl to achieve, in his view. Pure consciousness, which is defined by means of the phenomenological reduction, may not be regarded as consciousness of the ego in the natural sense. The ego in this case is not a man in the world, for the man in the world must be suspended along with all bodily things. The world of nature and our beliefs in all existence are put out of play. They are suspended and bracketed. Only pure consciousness remains, and that cannot be doubted. Since the reduction necessarily takes place in one's own ego, the beginning may be called the stage of egology. In other words, as a matter of method, the starting point of a radical philosophy, which aims to begin without assumptions concerning any kind of existence, is the stream of conscious experiences of an individual person. The reduction or the restriction to one's own conscious experiences is merely the first stage of the method. In order to avoid solipsism, while retaining the strict requirements of phenomenological description, it was then necessary to establish the reality of other egos, of other people, of course, in short. Although Husserl devoted considerable attention to this problem, his method of solving it has been regarded by many as inconclusive. Inferences drawn from the similarity of the bodies of other persons to the existence of their minds are hardly absolute. The concept of empathy is not a solution. Some members of the phenomenological movement have renounced this style of beginning and have begun with intersubjectivity, but in so doing, it must be admitted, they have forfeited the unique value of a procedure which permits one kind of finality in the analysis of experience. But it must be asked, does the method of doubt of Descartes himself establish certainty? Even if Descartes' procedure were rendered consistent, and if the doubting were carried through as far as it could go, It could only certify the present doubting experience as indubitable. The doubt I had a moment ago, or the experience which I just had, has already receded into the past. And if one has really taken to doubting, he may ask whether it could be a trick of memory that it really occurred. Absolute reliance could not be placed on the memory, so that one would be confined to the present experience as alone indubitable. But the present has already become past, and it is no longer certain that it ever was present. A solipsism of the present but passing moment is the outcome. One would have to depend upon a general mind or upon a doctrine of fixed essential structures, supertemporal in character, in order to extend the range of certainty to a larger realm. In either case, however, the special assumptions would have to be proved to apply to the actual course of experience and the world. It thus appears that the procedure of doubt is nugatory. It does not establish an absolutely certain subjective realm. It is impossible to avoid the continued challenge of doubt once the procedure has been adopted. That the doubting also applies to the subjective realm is the disconcerting consideration if one supposes with Husserl that Descartes had insight into the superiority of the inner realm of experience over the outer realm of natural existence in the achievement of certain knowledge. It will be granted that there is a liberating influence on one's thinking as a result of the procedure of doubt or of suspension. In phenomenology, this is achieved by the universal suspension of beliefs, which is the positive analog of doubt. With all beliefs and assumptions suspended, the phenomenologist has delimited a distinctive realm for inquiry, the realm of pure reflection, which might be called radical reflection. Every object in the existing world, natural or cultural, and every item of knowledge is now viewed only as a correlate of a particular experience of an individual reflecting person. The descriptive analysis is concerned with essential structures, such as, for example, are illustrated in perception, negation, intention and fulfillment in experience, and the like. They are therefore regarded as valid apart from the existence of actual human beings. It is sufficient that they be valid as determinations of possible types of experience. The principle that immanence, being in consciousness, is certain and transcendence, referring to the beyond, is problematical, is argued by Husserl at considerable length. In a manuscript which preceded his ideas of 1913 by some years, The Idea of Phenomenology, recently published, he shows how seriously he views the problem of transcendence. This problem as to whether there is a world of existence apart from our conscious experiences must be faced by anyone who retires to immanence, to pure reflection, if he wishes to have a complete philosophy. It would not be necessary to raise this question, the question of existence or of ontology, if one were satisfied from the outset with an ancillary, restricted study of experience from the point of view of radical reflection, beginning with one's own conscious experiences. But if one fails to see that he has a limited type of subjective procedure and endeavors to make his method apply to all types of question, he must deal with the problem of transcendence, of what lies beyond his experience. In Husserl's hands, this meant a program for a constitutive phenomenology, so-called. The meaning of world, as well as of culture and the like, must be traced out in the constitutive processes of experience. In short, it must be shown how complex meaning structures are constructed or constituted out of simpler elements, beginning with the rudiments of direct experience. Thus, the reduction to my individual field of experience is the preliminary preparatory stage of inquiry, and the constitutive procedure is the constructive stage. Unfortunately, Husserl insisted upon the idealistic principle of the primacy of the knower. The correlative point of view of his method, which was certainly well justified for the analysis of experience and its objects, became the means for an idealistic metaphysics. Bridging the gap between the descriptive analysis and the metaphysics was Husserl's version of ontology. It is misleading to speak of ideal meanings or of pure consciousness or of essences as being in any sense. If that happens, one has already taken a substantial step toward a new kind of metaphysical heaven. That is either sheer dogmatism or it is based upon confused and confusing usage, complicated by untenable reasoning. This aspect of Husserl's thought is sadly out of place in his fundamentally descriptive philosophy. It has borne fruits which Husserl could not condone, but which he was also not prepared to dispose of. It was a weakness of Husserl to shift from talk about meanings to talk about realities. That tended at times to obscure the fact that it was, for example, the world meaning that was to be constituted and not the world itself. The well-known world problem of phenomenology was engendered by the method itself. It is what may be called a methogenic problem. Similarly, Husserl's use of the expression world destruction or world nullification, his German term was Weltvernichtung, in connection with the reduction to pure consciousness, tended to suggest a terrific sense of power in the hands of the subjective philosopher. The procedure was innocent, of course, and there have been no complaints about contamination of the atmosphere. For after the great nullification, not even ashes remain, let alone natural complainants. If Husserl himself could at times give evidence of confusion on this basic point, it is understandable that his associate in the larger phenomenological movement, Max Scheler, could speak of fear of the mundane in connection with his religious philosophical interests. Max Scheler described himself as a co-founder of phenomenology, but he responded to mixed motives and cannot be regarded as a pure phenomenologist. Like Husserl, he was an ardent anti-naturalist and anti-evolutionist. But unlike Husserl, he had traditional religious commitments. Thus, he had a Catholic period. And he responded to various thought motives of the time. Thus, he was interested in developing a sociology of knowledge, which amounted to a kind of non-Marxian Marxism. Scheler's references to Marx show that he was aware of his general ideas, but he rendered them in a rather unsatisfactory and inadequate form. The extensive attack which he launched on the evolutionary philosophy could not survive critical inspection. Above all, Scheler was interested in establishing a preferred place for man, or one aspect of man, his spirit, in the cosmos. This was the aim of the philosophical anthropology which he tried to construct. For the rest, his World War I books helped to earn for him the place of an ideological precursor of the Nazis. As for Husserl, he was content to dismiss Marxism, evolutionary philosophy, and all other naturalistic views as naive and dogmatic, so that he didn't consider them at all. Far closer to Husserl, personally, was Martin Heidegger, who became Husserl's successor in Freiburg. Let me also add here that Heidegger sat at the feet of Husserl, even though he is declared not to have been his pupil. He was a very close student of Husserl and a profound admirer of him at one time until he became a Nazi. The limitations of the subjective method, contributed by Husserl as the sole type of method for philosophy, made students and readers receptive to what seemed to be a mode of deliverance from the incarceration in the realm of pure consciousness. The talk of being and existence of Heidegger suggested to his imaginative hearers that they were really to be led out of Husserl's promised land, as Husserl called the realm of pure consciousness, into the green pastures of the existing world. Heidegger's studied opaqueness of expression, making his text largely very difficult, if not inaccessible, to most of his readers or hearers, concealed the basic subjectivism of his thought. In contrast to Husserl's avowed and largely justifiable, although limited, subjectivism, Heidegger's thought may be characterized as misplaced subjectivism. No doubt that has aided rather than hindered the growing influence of Heidegger on so-called existential philosophy, since it has tended to develop mainly in circles with little or no knowledge of logic and scientific method. Receptivity to a verbal philosophy is understandable on the part of those who do not wish to be restricted by the facts concerning man and the world. it is preferable to them to indulge in general and untested pronouncements about man and existence, and it confers a heartwarming sense of power to declare that the special sciences are divisive and that the existential philosopher, largely uninformed, will deliver up a total unified view to compensate for the partial studies of the special scientists. Such overweening presumptuousness is abundantly displayed by Heidegger and others in this misplaced movement of subjectivism. Husserl has left some interesting comments about Heidegger's work in the form of marginalia in his copies of Heidegger's Being and Time and Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. This has not yet been published. I shall quote just a few choice ones. Whatever one must feel impelled to say in criticism of Husserl's special pleading for a general subjectivistic idealistic philosophy and the shallowness of his anti-naturalism, he was far superior in logical grasp and scientific knowledge to the word distortionist Heidegger. It will be of interest to quote just a few of these comments by Husserl about the work of his former student, who is now a major hope of a rising generation of existential philosophers. Husserl did not conceal his impatience with Heidegger's usage, asking, for example, what could be meant by the expression, the basic state of being of that which is, Heidegger's language. He asked about Heidegger's expression, the existential understanding. Is that clear? He spoke of the transference from the ego of phenomenology to existence in such a way that, I quote Husserl, everything becomes profoundly unclear and philosophically loses its value, unquote. Husserl also exclaimed with impatience in connection with Heidegger's talk about the call of conscience, always theological, ethical talk. And he referred to the vague generalities of Heidegger. All of this and more was in connection with the chief book of Heidegger, Being and Time, now about to appear in English. Concerning Heidegger's book on Kant, Husserl protested, that is rather fast and very unclear. But he did not, at the time at least, call attention to Heidegger's talk about the, quote Heidegger, concealed innate potentialities of man, the differences with respect to character, race, and sex, unquote Heidegger. Had he written his comments after the fateful year of 1933, the full significance of this passage would have been unmistakable. It is interesting to record Husserl as referring to the mythical being of Heidegger. When Heidegger asks whether we are not overcome by dizziness when we try to determine being, Husserl remarks that the dizziness comes only from the unclearness of the concept of being. Heidegger himself bears this out when he states that we come to the brink of complete darkness with the question of being. When Heidegger states that the finitude of existence, the understanding of being, lies in forgottenness, and that the foundation of metaphysics is a remembrance, he reveals his thought to be a form of subjectivism. He has not shown himself able to establish a theory of real being. That Husserl himself was puzzled above all by the problem of transcendence, especially real being, was due to his failure to appraise his own method as subordinated to general methodology. But his subjective method was supposed to fall short of real being and to be confined to pure subjective inquiry. This can be clearly seen in the case of Husserl's phenomenology, of course. In the case of Heidegger, his failure to set forth and clarify a method of procedure and his habit of using a strange vocabulary, at times straining language beyond the breaking point, prevents most readers from recognizing the barrenness of his so-called philosophy. All through its development, phenomenology has been subjected to criticism, both within and outside the field of academic philosophy. Nathorp, Wundt, Sigvart, Meyer, Ziehen, Watt were among the earlier critics of phenomenology. Husserl's repudiation of psychologism had an unsettling effect upon many of his contemporaries, and his own constructive aims were misunderstood. His development of a transcendental point of view resulted in estranging him from many scholars who had been impressed by his logical investigations. The standard reply to critics was to charge them with misunderstanding. That was said of writers such as Schlick and Külpe, and of Rickert and his sphere of influence. In addition to idealistic criticism emanating from the rival schools, there were unsympathetic reactions and uncompromising rejections of at least the transcendental version of phenomenology by numerous writers. Apart from the habitual warfare of the schools, the sharpest criticism has come from the ranks of the materialists. The question discussed by Naville, French writer, Marx or Husserl, was pertinent for France at the close of World War II, in view of the element of interest in subjectivism. So far as the French workers were concerned, Husserl would have had nothing to say to them, except perhaps, as he once remarked, that a working man is worthy of his hire. Although it would be pointless to the point of being amusing to suggest that subjectivism be of interest to workers as such, it does not follow that it is devoid of all possible social consequences. For all mankind, viewed ideally, every advance in basic understanding, every technique which adds to our knowledge, however abstract or general, may ultimately have practical value. The usefulness of subjectivism is to be judged in the same way in which the practical aspects of pure mathematics is judged. That it would not in the least suggest the slightest change in existing social relations anywhere may, however, be accepted as a foregone conclusion. More than subjectivism is required in order to solve social problems. To be sure, Husserl had considered the philosophers to have been responsible for the sad state of the world following from the First World War. His reasoning was simple. Clear thinking is necessary for sound action. The philosophers are specialists in clear thinking, and they have failed to come to any agreement. But it would have been difficult to impress even a dozen Frenchmen with the proposition that a descriptive subjectivism could be a constructive step toward a happier France. Ideally, Husserl had a point, but the more widespread adoption of a general logic conceived as a comprehensive methodology, which would comprise subjective procedures among other methods, would be far more to the point. Even so, one must be careful not to commit what may be called the rationalistic error or rationalistic dogma, according to which the acceptance of general principles necessarily would lead to the indicated goals. An awareness of the conflicting interests of our complex society and of the important part played by non-rational factors in influencing human conduct should enable us to understand why any supposed knowledge of what is right will not necessarily lead us to act in accordance with that knowledge. There would, however, be no general agreement on what is objectively right in any case of conflicting interests or of competing national interests. In the recent Russian literature, Professor Bykovsky has challenged subjectivism in his discussion of the de-objectification of philosophy. Assigning a leading role in the tendency to de-objectivize philosophy to phenomenology, he speaks of it as expelling the entire objective world and all real objects from philosophical inquiry. The result of the reduction outlined by Husserl, he says, was the removal of philosophy from all concern with real things. For the bracketing of the world means retirement to the pure immanence of consciousness. Now, calling attention to the anti-naturalism of Husserl, Bykovsky objects to the attempt to cultivate phenomenology without raising its fruits. In other words, he doesn't think anything can be done with it in any legitimate or constructive sense. He contends that it is unavoidable that a sterile scholastic flower should result on the tree of the eidetic reduction, and he asserts that that is well understood by the neo-scholastics who toy with phenomenology, as he puts it. Viewing phenomenology as an expression of opposition to philosophy conceived as a scientific worldview, he observes that the aim to be free from all partisanship prevents it from entering into the problems of actual life and social reality. Husserl is portrayed as working with the perspective of centuries to come, with non-interference in the great problems of our time the result. This is taken to be a betrayal of the social mission of philosophy. To speak of an endeavor to cultivate phenomenology without raising its fruits is to assume that phenomenology must be regarded as a universal philosophy, for otherwise the fruits would be limited to purely reflective or essential descriptions to a structural study of experience. There is, however, no necessary commitment to idealistic metaphysical principles. It does not imply cultivating symbolic logic without raising its fruits. if one recognizes symbolic logic as a legitimate and valuable discipline. The charge of unacceptable fruits in this case would involve going beyond symbolic logic, perhaps to a formal relativism or an escapist formal philosophy, which restricts the function of philosophy to the consideration of formal relationships. Symbolic logicism would be a queer philosophy, and a generalized subjectivism even queerer, that is, as generalized to a complete philosophy. The point is to construe phenomenology as a descriptive discipline solely, and to recognize the special conditions under which it operates, conditions from which it derives its special merits as well as limitations. It would no doubt conduce to greater clarity if the term subjective were replaced by the term reflective, which would allow for various types, including radical reflection. It will be well, finally, to take another look at the whole procedure of beginning without beliefs in existence of any kind. Everyone is entitled to a region of ignorance. Omniscience is impossible. There is permissible, even justifiable ignorance in everyday life and in scholarship. The theory of numbers, for example, belongs to the region of ignorance of most people, including many scientists, and no harm results therefrom. It is sufficient that a few experts know the history of ancient Egypt and other specialties. But there are also facts which immediately condition successful living and which no one can afford to ignore. Thus, no one should be ignorant of the nature of the world in its most prominent features, and certainly not of the social world. The philosopher who says that he must begin with a clean slate, suspending everything, incurs the possible danger of excessive ignorance. This may be called the error of excessive ignorance. He is guilty of exceeding the amount of ignorance to which he is entitled as a philosopher. One is reminded of the dictum proclaimed by one of the characters in Gogol's comedy, The Inspector General. Government officials were enjoined to steal only in accordance with their rank and not to exceed the right amount. What must a philosopher know? He must know that all the findings of the special sciences are valid for him as well as for everyone else, with the appropriate index of probability. He must know, at least in a general way, what those findings are and what they signify for a worldview. He must know the place of man in the universe and his place in the evolutionary as a process, as well as in the social order. He must also understand the nature of experience and knowing and the various factors, natural and cultural, which condition them. The philosopher who reduces himself to the status of a pinpoint knower, or more exactly a knower devoid of dimensions, and asks, "How come, world?" has simply committed the logical crime or fallacy of illicit ignorance. The adoption of an artificial procedure as an aid to the clarification of basic ideas and structures of experience does not mean that one has really withdrawn from the world. It is impossible to get outside nature or entirely away from human society. The basic fact of the independence of the world with respect to human experience is attested to by the bulk of experience and knowledge. It is supported sufficiently by the facts which establish man's recent emergence in the evolutionary process. The subtle arguments of philosophers to the contrary are based upon willful ignorance of pertinent facts as well as upon faulty logic. The phenomenologist in a strict sense, and not in a speculative sense, may be invited to bring his method into the group of methods devoted to the addition of knowledge and the solution of problems. He should not attempt to usurp the position of methods in general in any way, even for philosophy. There is no magic in the subjective approach of phenomenology or in the much admired cogito. From consciousness, only consciousness can come, and not the real world of existence. With this safeguard, it may be acknowledged that much is to be discerned within the so-called cogito, or thinking being, and that it is potentially of far-reaching value for thought and action. But there must be no room for unfounded and illogical metaphysical adventures. The world into which Edmund Husserl was born no longer exists. Neither are there even vestiges of the professorial world into which he found his way and developed as a thinker. The opposition to bygone examples of naturalism is outdated. Today, it would mean challenging the critically founded scientific view of the world and a more highly developed methodology operating on the basis of natural existence, and making use of conceptual devices for their instrumental and explanatory value, there would be no prospect of success in such a challenge on the part of a subjectivist. But there is something to be hoped for in a fruitful and cooperative undertaking with no thought of standpoint warfare. Were Husserl alive in 1959, he would have no choice but to join the ranks of the methodologists in general. He would be sure to make a place for himself there, for he really was an able man, and in his special field of inquiry, a truly creative thinker.